Previously on Tales of the Hunger Games, District 4's reaping saw a diverse group of 16 tributes reaped for the games, although this occasion was unfortunately marred with the violence committed by the district's remaining youths. During the 48 hours before the games, an alliance swiftly formed between good friends Gulf and Cyrena, along with the latter's cousin, Oceanel, whilst Angela remained a respected solo fighter in the eyes of the other tributes. As for Baffin and Shell, they had each kept a low profile during this time, and hardly seemed to be noticed by most of the other tributes. The games themselves then got off to a shocking start, which saw Undulon and Angler unexpectedly becoming early outs. Also fallen were Adria, Jean, and Pamlico, although the deaths of these tributes were far more expected in the eyes of the capital. With 4 hours now past and 10 tributes remaining, Gulf, Cyrena, and Oceanel were now resting in the central stretch of the arena, whilst Baffin was watching them from the cornucopia island, and Shell was hiding within the caves of the island's southern extremities. Shortly after these portraits were shown, Gulf asked Cyrena if she thought they should move from this vantage point at the top of the hill, as they had not seen any tributes in some time. Cyrena soon agreed, and suggested heading north along the central bay, to which Gulf nodded, and Oceanel seemed happy with this suggestion. Gernard watched from the southern bay as the trio initially travelled north along the beach, and appearing to believe that he was safe, he climbed up the hill between himself and Shell, to whom he spoke as she carved against the rocks below. However, when Gulf, Cyrena, and Oceanel had almost reached the northern peninsula, Oceanel looked back and suggested that they instead turn south to the forest between the central stretch and the southern peninsula. Gulf seemed confused by this idea, but Oceanel explained that tributes may be more likely to hide in this forest, and so they could potentially find them there. Cyrena hesitated, but agreed, and said that it would be more of a risk to enter this forest when it was dark, and so they should head there now, and after some more persuasion, Gulf agreed. The group therefore headed southwest across the Gorse Hills, and Dwayne watched them from the western side of the island, where he had just moved his head out of the cave in which he was hiding. Within 10 minutes, they had entered the forest, and they carefully moved together between the trees, each holding their tridents at the ready, but they failed to find any tributes, and soon after, they passed into the fields before the southern bay. Meanwhile, Gernard continued to speak to Shell, but it was clear that her attention was focused upon her drawings on the rock. Gernard then asked what she was drawing, and she responded that she liked to use her imagination. Whilst Gernard appeared slightly bewildered, he leaned over the edge of the hill and continued to look at these drawings in disbelief, but just as he was finally standing up, he let out a painful gasp, then looked down to see a trident's prong sticking out of his leg. Gernard immediately pulled the trident from the back of his leg before shouting in pain and falling forwards from the hill into the sea below. Gulf, who had thrown this trident, then sprinted towards this hill, with Cyrena and Oceanel in tow. As Gernard continued to shout in pain within the water, Shell jolted around, and after noticing the fin of a shark swimming past in the distance once more, she sprinted west along the edge of the island. Gulf then reached the top of the hill and grabbed his trident, before looking down to see Gernard trying to scramble forwards into the water, as Shell continued to run west. Gernard begged for mercy, but Gulf quickly jumped down, and Gernard dove forwards into the water, whilst viewers in Snow Square cheered with excitement at the sight of the approaching shark's fin. Gernard continued to swim as quickly as he could from Gulf, who waded into the water after him, while Cyrena cheered him on from the top of the hill. Oceanel watched in shock as Gulf caught up with Gernard, but after noticing the shark's fin, she shouted at Gulf to come back. Cyrena then shouted as well after noticing this danger, and even Gernard looked around to see why they were so frantic. He finally saw the shark's fin just a few meters away and screamed, before turning in the water, but the shark caught him within 3 seconds, whilst Gulf swam back to the shore with as much speed as he could muster. Following a rather gruesome display, Gernard's cannon sounded, and Gulf safely reached the shore. As the hovercraft then entered from above to collect Gernard's body, Gulf thanked Cyrena for having warned him about the shark, and Oceanel seemed to wonder why he was not thanking her, but she did not say anything. Cyrena said that they should probably return to the central stretch, then aim to find other tributes, and Gulf and Oceanel seemed content with this idea. Meanwhile, Baffin had been watching this incident from the cornucopia island, and Rubius said that this was actually a very strong position, that he would need to find fresh water soon or risk dehydration. As for Shell, she had continued north along the western edge of the island by gripping as tightly to the rocks as possible and keeping a close eye on the sea behind her for any approaching sharks. She eventually reached the lower half of the central stretch and soon found a small dark cave within the western rock face. Shell seemed exhausted from having just travelled along the rocks, but also relieved to find this cave, and she swiftly collapsed inside, before spending the next few minutes catching her breath, whilst looking back out into the sea for sharks. Over the next minute, the night vision camera inside the cave showed a sea turtle, which slowly crawled forwards, and within a minute it had crawled onto Shell's hand. She screamed in shock and scurried towards the cave's entrance, but looked back and squinted to see that it was just a turtle. Shell then moved back into the cave slightly and picked up this turtle, before bringing it into the light and looking at its face to see that it appeared harmless, whilst it waggled its short limbs about, and she placed it on the ground at her feet, where it slowly crawled forwards. Shell continued to watch the turtle, and she knocked her hand against its shell a few times, presumably in order to check how hard it was, and judging by the feeling of her fingers, it did indeed appear to have a rather hard shell. Shell then appeared pensive as she picked up the turtle, before slowly walking out of the cave and looking in both directions. She crept forwards and appeared ready to continue north, but after taking a few steps, she was knocked to the ground. Viewers saw that Dwayne had heard Shell scream earlier, and so he grabbed a small rock, before heading south along the western edge of this island in order to locate the source of this sound. He then jumped down onto Shell when he saw her, and this had knocked her into the sea. Although Shell had clearly hurt her head against a stone in the sea, she scurried to her feet, but Dwayne pushed her back down and held his hands against her neck. She was clearly struggling to breathe as he knelt on her forearms with his knees, which stopped her from even being able to move her hands as he forced her mouth beneath the water. Shell continued to jolt her body around as much as possible to push away Dwayne, whilst viewers in Snow Square cheered on whichever of these tributes they were supporting. Shell's body gradually stopped moving, and Dwayne appeared to relax his grip, but seconds later, the sea turtle that Shell had dropped began to crawl over her left hand. Although Shell's eyes had been closed as Dwayne strangled her, they suddenly opened, and she twisted violently to the right, which caused Dwayne to slip, then fall forwards, and his grip on Shell's arm was interrupted. She finally lifted her mouth from the water and gasped for breath, before grabbing the turtle by its underside and smacking its shell against Dwayne's knee. He shouted in pain and grabbed his knee with one hand, whilst gripping Shell's neck with the other. This saw her being pushed back into the water, but she quickly smacked the turtle's shell against Dwayne's ankle this time, and a loud crack was heard, which even made Rubius wince on a replay. Dwayne immediately fell backwards, and he howled in pain as he gripped his ankle, while Shell quickly clambered to her feet and grabbed the turtle once more. She stood up and watched Dwayne, who was now snarling back in pain and calling her names that needed to be censored. Yet as Shell looked at the turtle and appeared to consider what she should do with Dwayne, a loud crashing sound was heard from the east. Shell then climbed the rocks to see a large wave of approximately 400 meters in width that was slowly heading towards the central bay. Through the very loud crashes of this wave, Shell could hear Dwayne begging for mercy, but she replied that they could have been allies, before grabbing the turtle and running south along the shoreline. As the wave travelled east across the central bay, its sounds drowned out Dwayne's cries of pain and pleas for mercy, and Shell continued running south. Meanwhile, Gulf, Cyrena, and Oceanelle had been resting on a hill in the central stretch. As the wave suddenly appeared in the distance, Gulf and Cyrena grabbed their tridents, but Oceanelle followed them without grabbing her own trident or the bag that contained the water bottles and grill. As Cyrena looked back, she noticed the bag still lying there, and she shouted at Oceanelle to grab it, but Rubius noted during a replay that she would have most likely been hit if she had run back, due to the wave reaching this spot within the minute. Yet just as Oceanelle seemed to consider running back, Ling and Marinetta swooped in and grabbed the bag and trident before running south away from the path of the wave. However, the trio continued to run north, and they reached the safety of the northern peninsula, away from the wave, with several seconds remaining until it hit the island. Meanwhile, Shell had run far south enough to avoid the wave, and she rested by a cave on the island's western edge as she watched Ling and Marinetta enter the southern forest ahead. Once Dwayne's cannon sounded, Shell climbed up from the shoreline and hid within one of the gorse hills near the forest. She gripped onto the rocky shoreline as the water from the wave pulled her to the south, but she managed to hold on and tried to listen to Ling and Marinetta. As for Baffin, he had glanced over in terror from the cornucopia island as he saw the wave approaching. He immediately latched his bag around his shoulder and dove straight to the north. During a later replay, Rubius stated that he was impressed by how quickly Baffin had managed to swim, whilst also carrying a bag, but it was obvious that he would not manage to swim fast enough to avoid the wave. As it hit the island, Baffin was indeed swept up into the wave, and he subsequently disappeared as it travelled across the island. A cannon sounded a few seconds later, and after looking at the vertical camera that showed most of the central stretch flooded, Rubius stated that he could not tell which tribute this cannon belonged to. However, almost a minute later, Eugenia shouted in surprise as she spotted Baffin suddenly resurfacing from the water near the northern peninsula and gasping for breath as he looked around in a panic. Viewers in Snow Square cheered, but soon laughed as he spotted the bag containing his grill that had also rather remarkably resurfaced nearby. Baffin grabbed it and waded very slowly towards the path that led into the northern valley, where he proceeded to collapse in exhaustion. Over the next hour, most tributes rested and some even fell asleep. Meanwhile, the excess water from the wave was slowly drained from the edges of the arena, and the darkness of night gradually settled. Shell spent this time resting in the cave that was closest to the southern forest, from which she appeared able to hear Marinetta and Ling. These girls had managed to steal Oceanel's trident when she ran from the wave, but their efforts to practice throwing it appeared fruitless. Marinetta also became very angry with Ling for almost hitting her head with the trident, although upon hearing that they had this weapon, Shell appeared very excited, and she continued to listen carefully amidst the sound of waves hitting the shore around her. As for Baffin, he rested for a while on the path to the northern valley, before very slowly wading into the water and feeling along the floor of the sea with his hands, presumably for starfish. He was extremely careful during this time, but many of these fish had been pushed further away by the wave, and so he had to travel slightly further out. He was almost swept away once more, but eventually managed to find a royal starfish that he carried back to the shore. Baffin held the starfish at the ready, whilst approaching the grill that he had left on the path leading into the valley. He then made his way up this path and into the valley above, where he cooked the starfish inside the grill as he looked out to the sea. However, he soon heard Gulf and Cyrena on the beach beneath this valley, as they discussed their plans for the evening, whilst Oceanel waded through the nearby sea. When Baffin had been hunting fish in the far north of the arena, this trio were recovering in the northern section of the central stretch, within 2 of the largest gorse hills. However, Gulf soon became angry, and he shouted at Oceanel for forgetting their bag of supplies, and her trident, which she was supposed to be guarding. Oceanel apologized and looked at Cyrena, but she did not defend her. As Gulf headed to the west coast to look for fish, Oceanel asked Cyrena why she had not defended her just now, but Cyrena stated that although she was sorry, Oceanel should have grabbed this bag, to which he said nothing and stared ahead. An uncomfortable silence ensued between the girls until Gulf returned to them and stated that he could not find any fish on this side of the island. The trio therefore headed east and explored the seas beneath the northern valley, from which Baffin was now watching them. They then looked for fish through the darkness, during which time the underwater cameras showed that Cyrena unknowingly stood just an inch from the tentacle of a crown-of-thorns starfish, which would have likely injected her with fatal toxins if she had stepped upon it. However, a minute later, Gulf found another starfish of this type, which he skewered with his trident and brought back to the shore. As he walked back, Baffin appeared to be looking in Oceanel's direction and subtly gaining her attention, but it was too dark for her to see him, and she was not even looking up towards him. Gulf proceeded to slice the starfish with his trident, but just as Oceanel appeared tempted to grab a piece, Baffin shouted from above that it would kill them all. Whilst the crowds in the Snow Square watched in silent suspense, all 3 tributes on the beach below were clearly shocked to spot Baffin on the path above, but he continued that he had a cooked starfish that was safe to eat, and he would give the trio some in exchange for water. Cyrena was then heard whispering to Gulf to kill Baffin with his trident, but Oceanel whispered back from behind her that he had helped them when he could have killed them, and that he was not a threat. Gulf appeared to be listening to both girls as he looked up at Baffin, and Oceanel added that they could even use him to find Lucius and the other tributes. Baffin still seemed to be shaky in terror within the valley above, but Gulf eventually told him to come down with his hands in the air. Baffin slung the bag over his back and proceeded to walk very slowly down the first half of the path. He then stopped and asked if Gulf and Cyrena could drop their tridents for now, and although the pair looked at each other in confusion, Cyrena begrudgingly gritted her teeth and lowered her trident, before being copied by Gulf. Baffin continued forwards and introduced himself, but Cyrena interrupted and told him to take out the starfish that he claimed to be safe. Baffin did this, and he even ate one of its legs, then opened his mouth to show that he had fully swallowed it, and Oceanel stated that it seemed safe. Baffin then handed over the rest of the starfish and even the grill, whilst Gulf gave him one of their 2 bottles of water, before stating that he could drink half of its contents and not a drop more. However, Baffin appeared pleased with these conditions, and he asked the trio about the locations of the other 4 tributes, but they only seemed to know that Ling and Marinetta were likely to be to the south. Oceanel then asked Baffin about Lucius, and he stated that he did not know where he was, but the pair discussed him and his character, with Oceanel stating that he had been deliberately threatening during training, which appeared to surprise Baffin. Yet during this time, Gulf moved away to a nearby set of rocks, then eyed Cyrena through the darkness, and she soon joined him. The pair spoke about Baffin, and Gulf stated that he did not believe him to be a threat, but Cyrena asked what they would do with him once they had found Lucius. Whilst Oceanel continued to talk about Marinetta and Ling's relationship, Baffin looked around towards Gulf, and the boys appeared to make eye contact for a split second, before looking back to their respective conversation partners. Eugenia squealed that she did love it when they began to turn, and Gulf very quietly mentioned to Cyrena that Oceanel would need to die soon if she wanted to stand a chance of living one more month, but Cyrena appeared to become tearful as she looked back to her cousin. Gulf whispered to Cyrena to stay strong, and she breathed out as a tear appeared to fall from her eye. She then said that she was still hungry after the events of the day, and Gulf suggested that they use Baffin for what he was worth. Gulf then went over and asked Baffin to catch another fish, yet as he made this request, Horn of Plenty played, and the portraits of Dwayne, aged 17, and Gernard, aged 16, were shown in the sky, which left Gulf, aged 18, Marinetta, aged 16, Cyrena, aged 17, Oceanel, aged 16, Baffin, aged 12, Ling, aged 16, Lucius, aged 18, and Shell, aged 15, as the 8 remaining tributes. After the portraits were shown, Shell carefully climbed back up from the western edge of the island, before creeping behind a tree near the edge of the southern forest, where she was able to listen to Ling and Marinetta, who were sat within some trees just 10 meters away, and discussing where they could find food. Shell also appeared interested by their guesses as to where she and the other tributes were, and she even seemed slightly amused when Ling appeared to believe that she was already dead. The girls then practiced throwing the trident, although with little success, and Shell appeared amused to hear them arguing once more about how one should hold and throw this weapon, with Rubius commenting that they were both in fact wrong. However, Shell soon appeared to become tired of this conversation, and she remained behind the tree, where she took out the turtle, with which she once again made eye contact. Shell placed the turtle on the ground, and she watched with some amusement as it waddled ahead, but after a few seconds, her eyes widened, and she slowly let out a smile, as Eugenia quipped that she was up to something. Meanwhile, Gulf accompanied Baffin as he slowly made his way around the northern edge of the island, where there were some more starfish. Baffin soon managed to grab one of the toxic crown of thorn starfish with the trident that Cyrena had lent him, but Rubius voiced his surprise and confusion when he subtly placed the starfish behind a rock near the grill, whilst Oceanel and Cyrena remained several meters away, where they were discussing Ling and Marinetta's relationship. Baffin proceeded to wade back through the water towards Gulf, who managed to skewer a leather starfish just seconds later. He then walked back with the fish on the end of his trident, and Baffin returned to sit next to the grill, just in front of the crown of thorn starfish, so that it was not visible to Gulf. He approached Baffin, then slung the leather starfish at his feet, and asked if he could cook it, to which Baffin nodded and placed it in the grill. Gulf spoke to the girls and said that he would do a sweep with his trident, to which Cyrena nodded, and Oceanel did not react. While Cyrena watched Gulf walk into the area behind them, and Oceanel looked up at the stars, viewers in Snow Square voiced their excitement as Baffin carefully ripped off a piece of his bodysuit, before wrapping it around his fingers and looking at the crown of thorn starfish. Baffin glanced back to the girls, before very carefully and quietly trying to remove one of the starfish's thorns, but it snapped, which caused him to gasp, and Cyrena looked over towards him. She asked if everything was all right, and Baffin nodded, saying that he had just burned his finger on the grill, and she reminded him to be careful. Then he looked back and tried to pull on another thorn, and after almost 30 seconds of using more force, it came out, with toxins dripping off its end. Baffin then opened the grill and carefully sliced the cooked leather starfish into 2 pieces, one with 2 limbs and the other with 3. He then injected this thorn into one of the limbs on the smaller section, whilst Eugenia gasped in delighted suspense, and Rubius stated that the consumption of the crown of thorn toxins was extremely dangerous and could quickly cause nausea, dizziness, and even heart failure. Gulf then returned from his exploration of the nearby area, whilst Baffin managed to extract another thorn from the crown of thorn starfish, which he placed into the other limb of the leather starfish's smaller half. Cyrena looked over and asked if the starfish was ready, to which Baffin replied that he was waiting for it to cool down, before removing the thorns and bringing it over on his trident, in a way that placed the safe half towards him and the other half towards Gulf and Cyrena. Back in the southern end of the arena, Shell had continued to hide behind a tree, which allowed her to listen to Ling and Marinetta, whilst watching the turtle crawl ahead. She seemed to think once more, and crawled forwards to grab the turtle, before setting it down very carefully, so that it would travel through the trees and into Ling's reclined legs. Then she let it go. Shell slowly and silently headed to the west around Ling and Marinetta, whilst excited viewers could see that the turtle was nearing Ling. Shell then crept and hid behind a tree that lay almost 20 meters from these girls, where she waited for the next 10 minutes as the turtle gradually crawled towards them, until a cannon suddenly sounded, which was swiftly followed by another cannon, and intense screams soon after from the north of the arena, that were loud enough to be heard this far away. Shell gasped and peeked around the tree as Marinetta and Ling staggered to their feet. Within seconds, the hovercraft appeared in the south of the arena, but as the girls looked in this direction, Marinetta saw the turtle and screamed as it looked back to her. Ling grabbed the trident and slowly walked towards the turtle, as Marinetta frantically asked what it was. Once Ling was close enough, she announced that this was just a turtle, and Marinetta appeared to calm down, but just at that moment, Ling suddenly noticed Shell running in from her left. Upon a replay, it appeared that Shell was planning to grab the trident from Ling while she was distracted by Marinetta. Yet Ling spotted Shell approaching mere seconds before, and she waved the trident towards her. It narrowly avoided Shell's stomach, and she pushed it to the side, before smacking the palm of her hand into Ling's nose. This caused Ling to fall back and drop the trident on the floor, as blood sprayed from her nose. Shell then ran towards the trident, but Marinetta reached it just a second before, and waved it towards Shell. One of its prongs sliced her left side, and she winced as she jumped back, but when Marinetta continued to jab it towards Shell, she dumped back further, until Ling got up and ran up behind Shell. Marinetta then held off jabbing the trident towards Shell as Ling quickly approached, but Shell turned and jumped forwards, before kicking Ling in the jaw, and she yelped in pain as she fell to the ground. However, as Shell jolted back, she saw Marinetta jab the trident at her, and it very nearly hit Shell's heart. Marinetta then pushed it forwards once more, but Shell jumped to her left, and as Marinetta pulled the trident back, Shell pushed her against the nearest tree. Marinetta screamed for Ling, who was still on the ground and spitting out her teeth, but Shell smacked Marinetta's hand against the tree, which weakened her grip, and she dropped the trident. Marinetta let out a high-pitched scream, until Shell headbutted her and grabbed the trident from the ground. Ling then ran forwards and tried to attack, but Shell had already thrust its prongs into Marinetta's chest, and Ling screamed in horror. Shell turned back towards Ling, who was now screaming, yet upon appearing to realize that she was still in a fight to the death, Ling slowly stumbled back and turned to flee, whilst gasping and crying. Shell waited a little as she released the trident from Marinetta's chest, before taking a brief run up and throwing the trident, which flew through the air and into the back of Ling's head. She then fell forwards, and her cannon sounded before she had hit the ground. Shell slowly marched towards the trident, whilst Marinetta let out distressed groans, and held her hand out towards Ling, but as Shell returned, Marinetta's movement gradually ceased, and a cannon sounded. Throughout this fight, cheers of excitement, but also surprise, were heard throughout Snow Square, with Rubeus asking where Shell had been hiding this talent. As the hovercraft then collected the bodies, Shell looked around in an apparent daze, then collected the trident and the water bottle from Marinetta's pocket. Before sitting down against a tree, and for the next half hour, she used the prongs of the trident to sketch various moments of this fight in the dried mud below. Meanwhile, an intense silence rested over Snow Square, as Baffin had carefully brought the grill containing the starfish to where the girls were sat in front of him, with Cyrena to his left and Oceanel to his right. Cyrena seemed excited as he approached, and Eugenia commented about how carefully he was looking at the piece in front of him and the piece to his right, both of which were safe to eat. As Gulf walked back along the beach towards them, Baffin nervously told the girls to help themselves, but instead of taking the piece of starfish that was nearest to her, Cyrena grabbed the piece that sat in front of Oceanel, stating that she liked the charred pieces the most, and Baffin then realized to his disappointment that the safe pieces were indeed slightly darker than the others. As Cyrena ate, Oceanel helped herself to a little water, and Baffin appeared to be looking at her intently, but as she saw him, she simply smiled and took one of the intoxicated pieces. She then ate it, and Gulf sat down and did the same with the other toxic piece, before thanking Baffin for cooking, to which he nonchalantly replied that they were all welcome. Like many viewers, Eugenia was seen to hold her hands over her eyes in disbelief, and the quartet hardly said a word as they hungrily ate the starfish, although Baffin was noted to be darting his eyes around at the surrounding hills and back to Cyrena's trident in a regular pattern, with Rubius commenting that he was looking for an urgent escape. Yet seconds later, Gulf coughed intensely and spat out some of his starfish. Cyrena immediately asked how he felt, and he said that some had gone down the wrong tube, and she appeared relieved. Baffin was still looking around, but after seeing Oceanel finishing a bottle of water, he asked if they had any more, and Gulf said that there was another in the pile behind him. Baffin almost immediately got to his feet, and as Oceanel suddenly stopped chewing, he walked towards this pile. Gulf then felt his chest, and Baffin looked back, but as he grabbed the bottle of water, Oceanel suddenly vomited. Cyrena gasped, and Gulf got to his feet, before feeling his forearm and spitting out his fish. As Oceanel vomited once more, Cyrena shouted for Gulf, and she tried to help him to his feet, but he tripped and gripped onto his chest, shouting that his heart was going insane. Baffin then ran along the beach as Cyrena panicked and looked back towards him, before scowling and shouting a slew of threats as he continued to flee. Oceanel then stumbled into the water, but he slipped on a wet stone and fell sideways, hitting her head on another stone, and immediately knocking herself unconscious. Cyrena then shouted for Gulf and gripped onto his hand, but his skin was now turning a deep red, and the veins in his head were throbbing. She quickly ran back to grab some more water, but when she reached the pile and realized that Baffin had just taken the last bottle with him, Gulf gripped onto his heart and fell forwards into the sand. Then his cannon sounded just seconds later. Cyrena ran back and screamed his name, but she soon realized that it was of no use, and after looking over at Oceanel and seeing that she too was still, her cannon also sounded. The bodies were collected by the hovercraft soon after, and the surviving tributes rested, but appeared to use all their efforts to avoid sleeping. Cyrena still appeared shaken within the northern beach, while Shell remained in the southern forest, where she was gripping onto the trident so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. As for the boys, Baffin travelled slightly further down the east coast, then swam towards the Cornucopia Island, where he rested and looked out between the rocks, whilst Lucius had spent most of this evening hiding in a cave in the upper western edge of this central stretch. Yet after almost an hour had passed, Cyrena seemed to be muttering to herself, and she grabbed her trident, before marching down the eastern beach and looking out through the hills to her right. Baffin appeared to spot Cyrena walking across the central beach, but he kept his head beneath the rocks of the Cornucopia Island, and she headed past without spotting him. A few minutes later, Cyrena considerably slowed her pace when she neared the southern forest, and she held out her trident whilst glaring through the dark, presumably for any movement. Viewers in Snow Square could also see during this time that Shell was stood in the middle of this forest, where she was sat against a tree and looking out to the west, although her eyes appeared to close momentarily, and Eugenia stated that she must be exhausted from the day's events. However, Shell appeared to have no idea that Cyrena had entered the forest, or that she was now moving very cautiously south between the trees, whilst holding her trident at the ready and rotating after every few steps, in an apparent effort to visually scan all angles. Cyrena continued for a few more minutes, whilst the split screen in Snow Square showed that Shell appeared to have already fallen asleep. Cyrena then moved even closer, which was causing some viewers to shout at Shell to wake up. 2 more minutes passed, and Cyrena stepped past another tree. Then she looked left. She placed her hand over her mouth and let out a silent gasp as she saw Shell lying defenselessly against a tree that was only 10 meters away. Cyrena then hid behind the tree and breathed slowly as she readied her trident. Snow Square had now become silent with tension, as Cyrena re-emerged from behind the tree and slowly crept the 10 meters towards Shell. Cyrena held her trident in the air and took the last few steps until Shell suddenly flinched her head and Cyrena stopped in her tracks. Shell opened her eyes and briefly looked ahead, before twisting to the left to see Cyrena through the darkness, stood a few meters away with her trident at the ready. Shell maintained a grip on her own trident as she jumped to the east, but Cyrena sprinted after her, and Shell darted behind another tree. As Shell appeared to panic and catch her breath, Cyrena told her to come out, and Shell was seen on the night vision cameras to have her hand over her mouth as she heard Cyrena approach. Cyrena waited and looked around, while Shell silently edged sideways to stand behind the next tree, and Cyrena continued ahead, unknowingly in a slightly different direction to Shell. Cyrena waited for almost 10 seconds as Shell quietly walked around the tree, which allowed her to look out and see Cyrena, who was now looking back in bewilderment. Shell then very carefully lifted the trident before launching it between the trees and towards Cyrena, which entered the side of her neck, and she collapsed to her knees, whilst desperately trying to remove the trident, but to no avail. As Cyrena's breathing produced a more strained sound, Shell held her hands over her ears before sinking back against a tree and grimacing as Cyrena's painful murmurs gradually faded. Yet within a minute, a cannon sounded, and it was announced that Shell Doomer was the female victor of District 4's games, and that no physical harm could be committed against her. Many of Shell's supporters in Snow Square were now cheering, but she remained stoic and dazed, until she suddenly appeared to realize that her trident was still in Cyrena's neck, and as the Deathclaw lifted her body off the ground, Shell ran forwards and pulled the trident from Cyrena's neck. This seemed to interest Rubius in particular, who asked why Shell wanted her trident when she no longer needed to attack others or defend herself, to which Eugenia replied that she might not have finished fighting. For the next 2 hours, Shell slept peacefully within this forest, whilst Lucius tried to stay awake in a cave on the upper western side of the central stretch, and Baffin slept on the cornucopia island. At midnight, the portraits of Gulf, aged 18, Marinetta, aged 16, Cyrena, aged 17, Oceanel, aged 16, and Ling, aged 16, were all shown, which left only Shell, aged 15, Baffin, aged 12, and Lucius, aged 18, remaining. For the next 5 hours, the surviving 3 tributes remained in these locations and slept, whilst many viewers in Snow Square also tried to rest. Yet as the sun rose, Baffin became the first of the 3 to awaken, and after watching the shore for almost 15 minutes, he slipped into the sea and swam south across the central bay until he reached the sloping bay at the very south of the arena. Baffin looked around very carefully, before slowly heading along the island towards the forest where Shell was resting. As he entered the forest and noticed her sprawled out on the ground, he very slowly approached, and when he was just meters away, she stirred and jolted awake, before grabbing her trident and pointing it at Baffin, but he jumped back and said that he did not want to hurt her. As Shell appeared to come to her senses, she grinned and said that this was a good idea, or his tracker would explode. Yet whilst Baffin seemed unsure of how to reply to this comment, Shell stated that she was impressed with how long Baffin had lasted, and he let out a weak smile, before congratulating Shell for her victory. She nodded and said that Baffin just needed to find the other one, and he asked Shell if she knew where he was. She got up and approached Baffin, before handing him her trident and stating that she believed Lucius to be in the western caves. Shell then pulled the rock out of her pocket and began to carve stick figures into a piece of smooth bark on the tree behind her, whilst Baffin stood aimlessly with the trident. Yet after 10 seconds of Baffin remaining still, Shell turned around and asked if he was all right. He responded that she would not be able to trust or rely on Lucius in the grand final, and that it would be easier for her to kill him, as she was immune from physical harm. However, Shell responded that she needed to know that she could rely on Baffin, and that by killing Lucius like she asked, he would be able to prove it. He still seemed hesitant as Shell continued to etch a stick figure that resembled Cyrena, and Eugenia stated that he would be stupid to not at least try. But after Baffin continued to look around in a daze, Shell turned back and said that she would make a compromise. Baffin appeared pleased to listen, and Shell instructed him to be on guard, as she would bring Lucius to him instead. This caused an excited murmur in Snow Square as Baffin nodded, and Shell turned northwest and walked unarmed towards the caves on the lower west side of the central stretch. Baffin waited nervously for the next half hour as Shell peeked into each cave until she reached the northern end of the central stretch, at which point she seemed to worry that she may have misjudged Lucius's position. But just as she appeared to give up hope, he suddenly jumped out from one of the caves with a rock in his hand. Before saying anything else, Lucius asked if Shell had won, and she nodded, then asked if Lucius had any idea where Baffin was, but he simply asked who this was, and as Shell explained that he was the youngest tribute, Lucius appeared shocked that he was the last of his male opponents. She then told Lucius that she did not want to be with Baffin in the final, as he seemed too weak to be a worthy ally, and Lucius asked if Shell would help him look for Baffin, to which she nodded and said that he was not in the northern peninsula, which may mean that he was in the southern end of the island. Shell proceeded to lead the way south along the western edge of the central stretch, whilst occasionally looking up and grinning at the cameras when she passed them. As they walked, Lucius also voiced his opinions on the other district victors, but it was noted that Shell hardly reacted, and Rubius theorized that she did not want to ruffle any feathers before the grand final had even begun. As they neared the forest, many viewers in Snow Square were excitedly waking up for the approaching showdown, whilst Eugenia betted on Baffin successfully killing Lucius, although Rubius quickly disagreed and said that he would likely lose his nerve. The pair entered the forest soon after, and Lucius whispered to ask Shell if Baffin could be here, to which she quietly replied that he could be. They continued forwards, whilst Shell appeared to be looking around as much as Lucius. He then pointed to his right and whispered to Shell that he could hear movement, but seconds later a rustling was heard from a branch above, and Baffin dropped down. Lucius jumped in shock as the trident entered his shoulder and chest. Then he shouted and swore in pain as he fell to the ground. Shell turned around and watched as Lucius tried begging through his screams, but Baffin kicked him and snarled that it was a bad idea to have laughed at him during training. Baffin then removed the trident's prongs from Lucius's neck, which made him yell even louder and collapsed to the ground as he gripped onto his neck. After letting out what Eugenia later described as a primal roar, Baffin forced the trident through Lucius's back, and he fell to the ground just seconds later. Baffin stumbled back and fell onto the ground as he looked at Lucius's quivering body ceasing to move. Shell approached, and after Lucius's cannon sounded, she put her hand out to Baffin, and stated that they could be allies now. He appeared unsure about taking Shell's hand, but he was swiftly distracted when it was announced that Baffin Herricks was the male victor of District 4's games, and the hovercraft came down to collect him and Shell, amidst cheers and Snow Square. During the following analysis of District 4's games, which saw a lot of mentions about Baffin being the youngest male victor in the history of the games, Shell and Baffin were taken to Gaul Hospital, and after their minor injuries had been treated, they were declared to be in good health by Capital medics. The next morning, the pair were returned to the accommodation tower and held in separate apartments under the strict guard of peacekeepers, whilst the Avox team of stylists designed their outfits and ultimately decided to dress Shell in a deconstructed blue netted dress, and Baffin wore a white shirt and trousers, along with a sea blue waistcoat and tie. During their interviews, Eugenia commended both Shell and Baffin for their hidden skills that had helped them each to achieve victory, and enthusiastic applause sounded from the audience as the relevant footage was displayed on the screen above. Shell revealed that she and her brothers had in fact been practicing with tridents since the start of the district games, but she had worried about her accuracy, especially when throwing them, and she had therefore opted to not show the skill during the training, in case she looked weak to other tributes. Eugenia then informed her that due to her unlikely alliance with the turtle that she had found, Shell had humorously become known within the capital as Turtle Shell, and this made the audience laugh, while Shell joked that she would have liked a less repulsive nickname, but she would still take it. As for Baffin, he admitted to Eugenia that due to his family's trade as fishmongers, it had always been extremely important for him to identify any fish that could be toxic, so that he did not accidentally sell them to customers, before adding that he had opted to hide this skill, so that other tributes would still see him as weak. Eugenia then announced that Baffin was known as the Toxic 12-year-old, in reference to his intoxicating manner of killing, as well as his status as one of the only 2 victors of this age, which once again triggered applause from the audience, and Shell patted him on the back, with some viewers stating that the pair looked more like a pair of siblings instead of district allies. For the next 2 days, Baffin and Shell were both taken to many fine gatherings within the capital, including Coriolanus Snow III's 19th birthday party, Vivica Creed's final birthday party, and the opening of Bluebell Ring's fashion house. However, during the opening fashion show to the latter of these events, peacekeepers stormed the premises and ordered all guests inside except for Baffin and Shell. They were then ushered by the peacekeepers towards one of their vehicles, and instead of being returned to the accommodation tower, where the pair had apparently expected to stay this night, they were taken to Gaul Manor. Along with the other district victors, they were held in isolation for the next 42 hours, and it was only when they were released that they learned of the tragic events that had been occurring on the eastern coast of Panem whilst they had been in isolation. The mass of ships belonging to Germania, Sicily, and the Scandinavian Confederacy that had been stationed for the last week in the North Atlantic Ocean had suddenly moved west and was accompanied by jets from more European nations, which resulted in almost 30,000 troops of 8 European nations arriving in District 12 over the morning. This group of nations later claimed that they were acting in response to the events following District 4's reaping by saving and protecting the populations of the most vulnerable districts by removing them from the command of the capital and stopping their youths from participating in future games. It is therefore believed that these nations were either unaware of District 12's agreement to the Treaty of the Reclamation, or that they chose to ignore the terms of this treaty completely. These troops mercilessly slayed the serving peacekeepers in this district, whilst cutting the power to its station, ports and roads for the next month, which stopped any modes of transport from entering the district. Meanwhile, the European jets circled this airspace, and without negotiation, they shot down any hovercraft in this area that belonged to Panem, which resulted in many careless instances of damage and casualties when these hovercraft hit the ground. Despite attempts to negotiate with each of the 8 European nations, President Gaulle was forced to warn their troops and District 12 itself with ballistic missiles, yet he soon received a threatening combined response from these nations, which stated that they had missiles aimed for the capital from all sides of Panem. This aggressive message went on to state that if Panem's forces even attempted to re-enter District 12, which they were now calling Virginia, these missiles would be fired straight at the capital. In his wisdom, President Gaulle therefore decided to step back and allow the lowlives and degenerates of District 12 to become engulfed by these European nations. This is in fact the last account that we have of District 12, but it is believed by many that following the 100th Hunger Games, the land now known as Virginia underwent extreme changes in both its culture, politics, and financial structures. According to our intelligence, many European languages are now taught in its schools, and it is even known by some in America as the gateway to Europe. Back in the year 112, President Gaulle had wisely ordered for Astoro Diggs and Delilah Undersea, victors of District 12's games, to be held in his manor 2 weeks prior to these events. They therefore remained safe within the custody of the capital and available to play in the upcoming grand final. Many capital citizens even joked that due to District 12's poor performance throughout the history of the games, most viewers would not even notice that it had been removed.